You can listen to this episode of The After Act Show on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Link in the description. You're listening to The After Act Show. It's the 4th of September, 1807. Robert Morrison steps onto the deck of the Trident to take a breath of fresh air. He had spent the previous 113 days at sea, and was grateful he would soon have the privilege of standing on terra firma once more. Morrison looked out onto the shoreline of the land that he would soon call home. He had read stories of a mythical land ruled by a distant empire across the waves. Morrison chuckled to himself. Many of his friends and family had discouraged him from taking this voyage. He was well aware of the numerous obstacles that stood in his way. But Morrison wasn't worried. He knew full well that his God was a God that could move mountains. And there were many mountains to be moved here in China. As the vessel pulled into port, Morrison went over all of his training in England in his head. He recalled all the methods of evangelism he learned from the Gosport Mission Academy. Next, he recited some common Cantonese greetings. He recalled the many nights of practicing his speaking skills with his friend Sam Tack back in London. Even though Morrison had a basic grasp of Cantonese, he knew that he still had a long way to go if he wanted to speak the language fluently. Morrison was so busy recounting his learnings that he scarcely took in the gravity of the moment. For Robert Morrison would be the very first Protestant missionary to ever set foot in China. Robert Morrison was born on the 5th of January, 1782, near Northumberland, England. He was born to devout Presbyterian parents, who taught Morrison the Bible and the teachings of the Church of Scotland. By the age of 12, Morrison had fully memorized Psalm 119, the longest chapter in the entire Bible, consisting of 176 verses. Growing up, Morrison would work as a laborer for his father's business. He held tightly to his faith, read the Bible daily, attended church weekly, often visited the sick, and taught poor children in his spare time. Morrison joined the London Missionary Society in 1804, at the age of 22. He was deeply moved by missionary movements he read about in magazines when he was 17. For a time, it wasn't clear which mission field would be best suited for him. Africa was a popular destination at the time. Yet, Morrison felt called to something more. Somewhere even more challenging, with more difficulties. Somewhere truly insurmountable. The London Missionary Society hadn't quite prepared Robert Morrison for the trials he would come to face. He would adopt the Chinese name Ma Li Shun. During this time, foreigners were only allowed to stay in the cities of Macau and Canton, Canton being the modern-day city of Guangzhou. Furthermore, foreigners could only stay in China for the purposes of business and trade. Further still, it was expressly illegal for any local Chinese to teach foreigners the Chinese language. Perhaps most crucially of all, the Qing government had banned Christianity, or more specifically, Catholicism, in the year 1724. Protestantism would probably be too similar to Catholicism for the government's liking. As such, Morrison would live a life of seclusion, not wishing to draw any undue attention to himself. Qing officials would no doubt expel him back to England if they ever discovered his presence. In the early days of his mission, Morrison was practically chained to the small confines of his Canton residence. The men Morrison secretly hired to teach him the local language were all too willing to exploit him. Extortionate fees, robbery, textbooks with inflated price tags, threats of revealing his location to the local governor. Morrison had experienced it all. His isolation from the outside world would take its toll on him. Add to that the difficulty adjusting to the local cuisine, Morrison would struggle with consistent bouts of illness. On one occasion, the roof of the room Morrison was staying in collapsed. In response, his landlord increased his already expensive rent by 33% for the trouble. By this time, Morrison was struggling to pay for his living expenses. Confined to cramped quarters in Canton and Macau, unliked by the locals, shunned by his fellow expats, devoid of any friends, and suffering from disease, Morrison found himself in the presence of a truly daunting challenge. He reflected back to England, when he had felt a calling to go somewhere insurmountable. Was this what he had hoped for? Would he even be able to continue his mission? Would he see the mighty hand of God move the mountains in his way? Fortunately, Morrison met Mary Morton, a daughter of an executive of the British East India Company. They would marry on the 20th of February, 1809. By this time, Morrison's Chinese was sufficient enough to gain employment at the British East India Company, or BEIC for short. He would work as a translator. This job would provide Morrison several benefits. For a yearly stipend of £500, Morrison would be able to further practice his Cantonese and Mandarin. His new position wouldn't impede any of his missionary efforts, which always took priority over everything else. Since Morrison was now officially employed at the BEIC, he could legally take residence in China. His connections with the BEIC allowed Morrison to interact with Chinese traders and businessmen. Things were beginning to look up for our missionary friend. During the times when he wasn't doing official translation work, Morrison would focus on producing written works for evangelism purposes. He would print catechisms into Chinese, create tracts to distribute to the public, and translate several books of the Bible into Chinese. However, the Qing government had caught wind of Morrison's publishings. In 1814, the Manchus issued an addendum to the 1724 edict banning of Christianity. The law reads as follows: anybody found to be promoting Christianity, distributing Christian books, or gathering people for sermons would be sentenced to immediate death by strangulation. It was clear that the ruling Manchus did not appreciate Morrison's missionary work. A tribunal was arranged to examine Morrison's illegal propagation of Christian texts. Morrison complied without resistance and headed towards the tribunal without fear. He knew that he may not leave the tribunal alive. After a lengthy trial, it was decided that Morrison would not be put to death, largely due to his position at the BEIC. His mastery of the Chinese languages had made him too indispensable for the company. He had miraculously evaded certain death and would be able to continue his missionary work in China. And so, the hand of God was slowly beginning to move. In 1816, Lord Amherst was sent as a British ambassador to Beijing. The purpose of this embassy was to renegotiate more favorable trading terms for the British. Morrison was invited to participate on this expedition. The journey would be an eye-opening experience for him. This would be the first time Morrison would set foot onto the Chinese mainland. On his way to the imperial capital, Morrison would pass by many poor villages. There was not a single mission station on the way. It was a journey that renewed his missionary zeal. The poverty and illness that Morrison witnessed greatly moved him. He would return to Canton with a greater resolve of his mission in China. In 1820, Morrison opened a public dispensary in Canton, where free Western medicine would be handed out. Many of the poor peasantry were motivated to spend all of their meager funds to purchase worthless Oriental medicines. Morrison, who had studied medicine back in England, was up to the task. His previous expedition to Beijing must have motivated him to action. Morrison would do everything he could to alleviate some of the pains of the Chinese. In the following years, Morrison would produce a wealth of information and literature. Morrison would complete a grammar of the Chinese language in 1812. The work would be published and see massive critical acclaim back home in England. It helped the English and American public demystify the Chinese language. His translation of the Bible took 12 years, and his Chinese dictionary took 16 years. He translated many classical Chinese works into English, including several Confucian texts. He printed books on Chinese customs, culture, geography, and religion. Many of his works would find their way back to Britain, which helped spread a wider awareness of China in the minds of the public. Morrison would return to England in 1824. He would be made a Fellow of the Royal Society as a world-renowned sinologist. During his stay in England, Morrison taught Chinese classes and helped spread further awareness of China. He even had the opportunity to present his Chinese Bible to King George IV. In November of 1824, Morrison would remarry to Eliza Armstrong, for Mary had died in 1821 in Macau. On his return trip from England back to China, the poorly paid crew revolted in open mutiny. They seized the ship's stock of firearms and intended on killing the ship's captain. Morrison, without hesitation, approached the mutinous crew and managed to calmly persuade the crew to return to their post. Morrison didn't fear the mutineers, for he placed his fear in someone far greater than they. As the years passed, Morrison observed a concerning new trend. Several shady establishments had popped up in his Canton neighborhood. Curious one evening, Morrison went to examine one of these buildings. As he observed the entryway on the bustling street, he would occasionally glimpse a patron hurriedly disappear behind the dark curtains. He could detect a faint, mysterious smell emanating from behind the drapes. Yet, strangely, Morrison thought the scent was vaguely familiar. Then, the pieces all fell together. He had stumbled across a secret opium den. Now, before I continue with our story, let's have a chat about opium. Opium is a depressant drug, meaning that it slows down neural activity and has a calming effect. Anybody who's had one too many drinks knows what I'm talking about. Opium is produced from poppy seeds in India, which at the time was controlled by the British East India Company. It is a highly addictive substance. In fact, the word opioid is derived from opium. In other words, opium is the world's first opioid. Now, back to the story. Morrison had encountered opium in the past. His colleagues at the British East India Company were the ones who held the monopoly on the opium trade. In fact, as the years went on, opium became increasingly the predominant good that the company would trade with. In exchange, the businessmen would return with crates full of porcelain, silk, and most importantly, tea. Morrison himself despised the drug. In the coming years, he would come to fully realize how harmful to Chinese society opium was. Stories of fathers selling their children just so they could get tomorrow's fill of opium were not unheard of. Opium addicts would spend days on end in opium dens, smoking their lives away. Opium was slowly addicting an entire nation, threatening to collapse the foundations upon which Chinese civilization stood upon. Morrison and his fellow missionaries were appalled by the trade. They regarded opium as an evil perpetrated by their countrymen. Many of the missionaries were embarrassed by the fact that they arrived in China in ships filled with opium. In one of his letters, Morrison writes this on opium. "The more I pondered, the more I became convinced that the smuggling of opium into China is inconsistent with gospel morality. Could I hold out the bread of life to the Chinese in one hand and opium in the other? It is impossible to serve both God and mammon." William Milne, one of Morrison's contemporaries, writes this: "A practice so destructive of social order, and which so effectually impoverishes a large portion of the people, to enrich a few, generally of the worst characters, should have ever been sanctioned by any Christian government, and a portion of the public revenue derived therefrom, furnishes just cause of astonishment." The Qing government was all too aware of the growing opium problem. They had tried unsuccessfully to ban opium several times in the past. Yet, the more they tried to clamp down on the trade, the further the lengths smugglers went to make their fortunes on the trade of opium. Try as they might, the cries of Morrison and his fellow missionaries to end the opium trade fell on deaf ears. Opium was simply the only product that British had that the Chinese wanted. China had no need of any of the British goods. Neither did they want them, nor did they require them. The demand for Chinese-made goods in Britain was enormous, especially for tea. There was too much money at stake for the British to simply end the opium trade. By 1834, Robert Morrison was growing weak. He had continually suffered from illness, and his family had returned to England. On the first day of August, 1834, Robert Morrison, father of Protestant missions in China, would pass away at the age of 52. Had he lived only 5 years longer, he may have witnessed British gunboats sailing up and down the Pearl River and opening fire. By 1839, the Daoguang Emperor had had enough of the opium that was wreaking havoc on his nation. He needed to deal with the opium problem once and for all. He chose the governor of Hunan and Hubei provinces to solve the issue, a man by the name of Lin Zeshi, or Commissioner Lin. Lin is one of the heroes of Chinese history, a man who is portrayed as someone who was unafraid of standing up to the Western imperial powers. Lin demanded that the Western merchants cede all of their opium to the state. The merchants, believing that they would be compensated for their losses, obliged. Thus, on the 3rd of June, 1839, near a small town at the mouth of the Pearl River, Commissioner Lin destroyed all of the opium. This event, known as the Humen Shaoyan in Chinese, was the turning point in Anglo-Chinese relations. The British demanded that the Chinese government compensate them for their loss. The Chinese refused. In response, Britain sent an expeditionary force and several warships to China. The First Opium War had just begun. To summarize how the war went, the quality of the British military was vastly superior to the Chinese. China had no effective methods of preventing the British gunboat barrage. The Chinese suffered defeat after defeat at the hands of the Royal Navy. The Chinese war junks, made with paper, were no match for the modern gunboats of the British. In 1842, Britain blockaded the vital Yangtze River and cut off the Grand Canal. Not wanting to escalate the war any further, the Qing government sued for peace. And on the 29th of August, 1842, both parties signed the Treaty of Nanjing, thereby ending the First Opium War. These are the terms of the treaty. Number 1, China would pay a massive war indemnity to Britain. Number 2, 5 ports would be opened up for foreigners to reside and conduct business in. These ports are Canton, Xiamen, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and Shanghai. Number 3, foreigners would have extraterritorial rights in China. This means that British nationals in China would be subject to British laws, not Chinese ones. Number 4, China would cede the island of Hong Kong to Britain. The terms of this treaty were utterly humiliating to the Chinese. For centuries, the Middle Kingdom had been the most advanced nation on the planet. Its empire was proud, and it would see many tributary nations bow at the feet of the emperors. All of this was undone at the stroke of a pen. For the first time in centuries, China had been decisively defeated by barbarians and would suffer the shame of many more treaties to come. A couple of years later, France and the United States would sign their own unequal treaty with China. These treaties marked the beginning of the century of humiliation for China, the 百年国耻. The interpreter of the treaty for the British would be none other than John Robert Morrison, the son of our late friend Robert Morrison. Could either of them have known the far-reaching impacts this treaty would have on the future missions of China? Although the treaty didn't specify anything on the matter of religion, the implications were clear. Any future missionaries going to China now had the right to legally stay in the 5 treaty ports. Gone were the days when missionaries hid away in cramped attics to escape attention. In the wake of the treaty, several missionary societies established themselves in the treaty ports. In the years to come, a slew of new missionaries would come to China in hopes of turning the dragon to Christ. In his 27 years of mission in China, Robert Morrison would baptize a grand total of 10 converts. By numerical impact, Morrison could be considered a failure. However, his impact on future missions to China cannot be understated. His writings would be the basis that all future Chinese missionaries based their education on. His medical dispensary would provide access to Western medicines, previously unknown to the Chinese. In 1818, Morrison founded the Anglo-Chinese College in Malacca to promote East-West cultural exchange. Morrison would spend £1,000 of his own money to help build the school. The school would move to Hong Kong in 1843, after Hong Kong was ceded to Britain in the Treaty of Nanjing. The school, now known as Yinghua College, serves as a boys' secondary school. It is the oldest school in all of Hong Kong, now being over 200 years old. Robert Morrison is truly an exemplary servant of God. He voyaged to China knowing full well that he may be killed for doing so. He faced life-threatening obstacles, yet he addressed them without fear. He was content to remain a maverick, being mocked and scoffed at by even his closest relatives. His efforts were not bearing fruit. Yet, Morrison would push on. Morrison couldn't have possibly known the impact he would have on future missions to China. When he passed in 1834, China was as closed off from the rest of the world as it had been when he arrived in 1807. For all he knew, China may have been closed off for another 1,000 years. But he pushed on and strove to run the good race. In the end, Morrison would be buried in the land that he had spent more than half his life serving in. His body is buried at the old Protestant cemetery in Macau, where an epitaph memorializes his legacy. This is what is written. Sacred to the memory of Robert Morrison, the first Protestant missionary to China, where after a service of 27 years, cheerfully spent in extending the kingdom of the blessed Redeemer, he sweetly slept in Jesus. Blessed are the dead which die in the Lord from henceforth. Yea, saith the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors, and the works do follow them.